Welcome to the Ex-Religious Support Network. Now, our aim is to provide a safe space for people who have left or are thinking of leaving their religion. To find us on Meetup, simply search for Ex-Religious Support Network. On Facebook, search for Ex-Religious Discussion Group. My name's Les Allen and I'm the group facilitator. This is the final session in a series of 3 sessions exploring various aspects of religion and emotion, presented by professional counsellor Caroline Winzenried. Caroline started this series with her talk titled The Emotional Landscape of Religion, Emotions as Good or Bad, in which she examined how various religions categorise emotions and encourage us to embrace some while disowning others. In her second session on spiritual bypassing, the dangers of disconnecting from emotions, she explored how spiritual ideas and practices are sometimes used to avoid or suppress emotions and the damage this can cause. In today's session, Caroline will consider how we can begin the meaningful journey of reconnecting with your emotions. So, a little about Caroline Winzenried. She is a counsellor working from Boronia here in Victoria, Australia. Caroline works from an existential humanistic lens with individuals across the lifespan, from adolescent to older adults, on issues including anxiety, depression, and interpersonal relationships. Her areas of special interest include working with religious trauma and grief and loss. So please join me in welcoming Caroline.
Thank you. And it's so good to be here again tonight and to see you all again. I'm really excited to dive into this third part of the series and talk about something that is quite important to me, and I think a really integral part of our human experience of really opening ourselves up to emotions. And I'll give my my presentation a go here. Let's see if I can get it up. Okay. My name is Caroline Winzenried, and I'm here tonight to cap off the 3-part series on the connection between religion and emotion by talking about reconnecting with our emotions and what happens when we bring in curiosity. So this presentation is the final part of a 3-part series exploring the relationship between religion and emotion. In the first presentation, we took a look at the emotional landscape of religion through the lens of 2 different spiritual practices, Christianity and Buddhism. We spent some time exploring how each of these traditions conceptualizes different emotions. In the second presentation, we defined spiritual bypassing and explored what happens when we disconnect from our emotions through spiritual practices. Let's start this final presentation with a quick recap into spiritual bypassing. We'll also recap why emotions are important, and we'll review through our case study of Paul what happens when we disconnect from them through spiritual bypassing. Next, we'll move into the nitty-gritty of what you can do to reconnect with your emotions and the powerful wisdom that they have to offer. As we've discussed in the first couple parts of the series, many people from religious backgrounds are taught that some emotions are bad and that they need to be gotten rid of. Through practices which can include prayer, suppression, and avoidance, they learn to disconnect themselves from their emotional experience and paper over everything with an exclusively spiritual lens. Cashwell and colleagues define this practice in their 2007 study as one in which a person attempts to heal psychological wounds at the spiritual level only and avoids the important, albeit often difficult and painful, work at the other levels, including the cognitive, physical, emotional, and interpersonal. We also discussed in part 2 how emotions are a rich source of information. Emotions serve many different purposes, and to name just a few, they can tell us about what we value, They can motivate us toward action, help us make decisions, and communicate our intentions. When we cut ourselves off from this part of our experience, we don't get the benefit of that wisdom. To make matters worse, the emotions we try to get rid of don't go away. They just get thrust into the shadows, where they continue to operate without our knowledge. We actually need to be in touch with our emotions to effectively regulate and respond to them. Otherwise, we wind up marching to a drum we can't even hear, leaving us feeling confused, overwhelmed, and stuck. Last time we took a look at a case study that illustrates the importance of emotions, which I'd like to just briefly recap here. Paul struggled with substance abuse connected to his painful childhood. When he joined Alcoholics Anonymous, he learned how to spiritual bypass through prayer and reframing. This helped with his substance abuse, but it didn't address the root of the issue, the hurt and the anger he felt from his childhood. He found that he kept lashing out at people around him and couldn't understand why. When Paul went to counseling, he began to approach his anger and hurt with curiosity and compassion. This was the key to understanding and feeling empowered to respond to these feelings, rather than to live his life feeling controlled by them. As we can see from this case study with Paul, emotions we try to disconnect from and disown don't just go away. They keep operating in the background, invisible. But by tuning into our emotional experience, we can actually tap into what our emotions are trying to tell us and choose how we'd like to respond to them. We can move through them instead of being stuck in them. We saw in the case study with Paul that he had a difficult relationship to his anger and his sadness. It was hard for him to tune into them and really try to understand them. And because he didn't, he wound up feeling confused and controlled by them. Part of tuning into our emotions is examining the relationships we have to them. We all carry beliefs about our emotions and feelings about the emotions that inform our relationships to them. What do you know about yours? As we begin to approach our emotions with curiosity, it can help to begin with a little reflection on what we know about our relationships with them. Which emotions get the most attention and compassion from you? Which emotions might need a little more of that attention and compassion? It's also helpful to think about how this might be influenced by the values you've attached to them, values that perhaps you learned from your religious upbringing. Are there some emotions that your religion taught you were good or bad? What messages do you carry with you about your emotions, and can you remember where you learned these? Everyone has different relationships to their emotions, sometimes gravitating toward particular ones more than others. But it can be a sign of a disconnect or of a belief that an emotion is bad if you find yourself tempted to say that you never or almost never experience it. Now that we know how important it is to get in touch with our emotions, I'm sure you're all wondering, how do we actually do that? As we reconnect with our emotions, we want to approach them with mindfulness, curiosity, and compassion. In the next few slides, I'll touch on each of these elements and we'll give a few examples of how to utilize them. If we want to connect to our emotions, we need to first make space for them. By being mindful, we can be present with the experiences we're having in our emotions, in our cognitive space, our physical space, all of these different domains of experience. The goal is to notice what's there for you without judgment, just allowing it to be. Often we are taught to try to get rid of these emotions that we're told are bad, and so making a space for any and all emotions without trying to make them go away is a critical first step. Next, we want to bring in some curiosity about our emotions, noticing how we experience them without making assumptions. The goal is to put aside ideas we have about what we think sadness, anger, or joy should feel like, and really open ourselves up to trying to understand what our experience of them is really like. I'll give you an idea of some questions you can ask to get yourself in that curious mindset. Notice how these questions involve information not just from our emotional domain of experience, but also from domains including the physical and cognitive levels of our experience to help give us some insight into our emotions. And these questions include, what does this emotion feel like right now in this situation? Does it bring an image to mind? Does it have a color, a temperature, or a shape? Do you feel it somewhere in your body? What thoughts is it connected to? What happens when you notice it? And lastly, what does it want you to know? This last question is so important because, as we've discussed, emotions are trying to tell us something. By being curious, not only do we tune into that information that they have to offer us, but we can also let it know that it doesn't have to tell us so loudly because we're listening. Lastly, we want to tune into how we can offer care and compassion to our emotional experience. Some questions to consider as you think about how to offer this can include, what does this emotion need from you? What would soothe it? How can you thank it for the information that it's offered you? And how can you let it know that you're listening? Tuning into what the emotion needs from you can help you find clues for how to move through the emotion and put the information that it's offering you to use instead of being stuck in it. This can also help soften intense and overwhelming emotions. They are just trying to get our attention, and by listening and offering them care, we can let them know that they don't need to be blasting the alarms. We've gone over some key questions to ask ourselves when we're trying to tune into our emotions. Now I'd like to dive in a little deeper and explore some tailored questions that can help us with specific emotions. I'll be using anger and sadness as two examples. You may recognize this slide from part 2, when we talked about how each emotion, even ones that we might be used to considering bad, can actually provide unique and helpful insights. We'll use these ideas to help us construct some pointed questions for anger and sadness. Some specific questions that we can ask our anger include, what is this anger trying to protect? Do I have boundaries that I feel have been crossed? Do I have needs that aren't being met? Do I sense that something I value is at risk? And finally, what changes can I make to address this? These changes might be interpersonal, such as setting boundaries or having a discussion about our needs. They could be cognitive, revisiting the narrative, or they could be physical, such as getting some space or changing my environment. Some specific additional questions we can ask about our sadness include, what was meaningful to me about what I've lost? What about the loss do I need to let go of? And is there an element of the loss that I can hold on to? How can I adapt to the loss? And finally, do I need some extra support? What kind of support do I need? The strategies that we've just discussed all rely on a baseline ability to recognize your emotions when they come up. But this first step can often be very challenging for people whose religious teachings encourage them to cut themselves off from their emotions. So let's discuss some strategies for building that emotional awareness. In the next few slides, I'm going to go through 7 strategies that you can use to work this muscle and start thinking about your emotions in new ways. A great place to start with this can be to expand your emotional vocabulary. Resources like emotion wheels can give us a list of emotional words to reference. By trying these words on, we can see what fits our own emotional experience. It can also deepen our awareness by helping us to get specific. If I know that I'm feeling fearful, but it feels different to other times that I've felt fearful, I could use an emotion wheel to zero in on what kind of fear I'm feeling. Once I know that I'm feeling excluded, I can reflect on how that kind of fear feels different to the fear maybe that I usually feel of being overwhelmed. We can also learn about our own emotional experiences by reflecting on the experiences of fictional characters. As you read a book or watch a movie or TV show, challenge yourself to reflect in depth on the emotional experiences of the characters. Maybe you could ask yourself, what are they feeling? What clues you into their emotional experience? Have you ever felt like that before? And if so, when? How does this character respond to their emotions? Would you respond the same way in a similar situation? Or would you respond differently? Why? If you have trouble identifying your emotions, it can also help to think of some times when you can remember feeling them strongly. What kind of physical, cognitive, interpersonal, spiritual, or philosophical experiences accompanied that emotion? What can you learn about these connections that might help you identify the emotion in other instances, even when it's not as strong? Journaling can be a helpful way to consolidate what you're learning and to build a reference to look back on. This can look like a daily diary or even a mood journal. Sometimes our loved ones and friends notice things about us that we don't see. We might be surprised to hear them reflect to us that we seem sad, angry, or nervous. Listening to a friend or loved one's experience of us can give us a window into our emotions from the outside. But it is important to be mindful that their perspective is only one perspective and will be colored by their own personal experiences and beliefs. One other thing that you can do to really build that emotional awareness is to dedicate some time each day to reflect on your emotional experience, drawing on information from other domains, including physical, cognitive, or interpersonal. This is because all of these domains of experience are connected and they contain vital information about each other. See if you can rate the intensity of this emotion that you notice from 1 to 10, and see if you can notice what tells you you're at that number. We've touched on this a bit throughout the presentation today, but as we explore how to identify our emotions, you may have noticed that many of these strategies ask us to tap into our other domains of experiencing. This is because everything is connected, containing vital information about each level of experiencing. One of the big problems that we discussed with spiritual bypassing is that it cuts us off from this naturally interconnected web of experiences that helps us to understand our world. As we explore how to tune into our emotions, we need to put that experiential domain into context with the others: cognitive, physical, emotional, interpersonal, and spiritual or philosophical. It is connected to all of these. And in doing this, we can build a fuller picture. Looking at the other domains can also be a great starting place for building emotional awareness. If you're very attuned to your physical experience, for example, or your cognitive experience, these can help tell you about your emotional experience too. The information we get from each of these domains can provide clues about our experiences in others. We can put all of this together to get a more complete picture and find a way to understand and respond to our experience. I'll give you a few examples of what this can look like. We can glean information from physical, cognitive, interpersonal, and the spiritual or philosophical domains to learn about our emotional experience. In this example, we can tune into our physical experience, such as clenching your stomach before a meeting, to learn about our emotional experience, that we may be experiencing anxiety. This works the other way around as well. We can tap into our emotional domain and understand more fully what's happening in our cognitive domain. For example, if we notice that we're feeling jealousy, we may get curious about the cognitions that are connected to that and notice that we're carrying a belief about our self-worth. In this example, that having a nice car is an important measure of my self-worth. Now that we've gone over some generally applicable strategies for tuning into your emotions and building emotional awareness, I'd like to end by sharing a few specific exercises you can look up and give a try if you're interested. Focusing, pioneered by Eugene Gendlin, can be a particularly useful strategy for anyone who has a very strong cognitive understanding of their experience, but struggles to really feel their feelings. I'd also suggest the Rain Meditation by Tara Brach, which incorporates the fundamentals of mindfulness, curiosity, and compassion in connecting to emotions. While the meditation itself is not inherently spiritual, please note that Tara Brach does draw on Buddhist ideas in her work, in case that may be triggering. Finally, I'd like to suggest dropping the anchor, which is an exercise from acceptance and commitment therapy that helps to build mindfulness and acceptance around emotions by situating them in the context of other areas of our experience and helping to hold these emotions even when we feel overwhelmed. Okay, so we can continue to talk about emotional regulation because this is a really important part of opening ourselves up to our emotions. And what I mean by emotional regulation is turning the volume up or down on our emotions. As we've explored, emotions are spontaneous and automatic. We don't choose to have them, but we can choose how we respond to them. We can turn the volume up to listen to the important information they offer, as we've been exploring in some of those reflective exercises. But we can also turn the volume down, and this can soothe overwhelming emotions and make space for other parts of our experiencing. And this graph here kind of gives us a look at what that means to turn that volume up or down. When we turn the volume up, what we're doing is we're bringing attention to our emotions, being curious about them, and using meditative and reflective exercises to really tune into them. When we turn the volume down, we're engaging in cognitive reappraisals, contextualization, mindfulness, acceptance, and flexible attention. And that's a bit of jargon there, so I'm going to give you a couple examples of what some of that means. One example that I like is if you're driving and someone cuts you off, you might feel quite angry because the way that you're interpreting that event is that they're being a reckless driver and they don't care about anyone else's safety. But if you take a moment to explore that interpretation and open it up a little bit, you can use a cognitive reappraisal and see if you can reinterpret the event. You can consider that maybe that person just realized they had to exit, they have to make it to a meeting, and they actually weren't even thinking about the other drivers, but they feel bad about what happened. And in opening ourselves up to these different interpretations, we can find that that changes the narrative that's attached to that emotion, and that can actually turn the volume down on that emotion. We can also use flexible attention to bring our awareness to other parts of our experiencing. Instead of letting the emotional experience take up all this space and all of our attention, we can be flexible with that attention. If we're running late for a meeting and we're stuck in traffic, we notice we keep looking at the clock in the car, we keep thinking about how angry our boss is going to be, we're letting that emotion take up a lot of space. And so what we want to do is be flexible, bring that attention into other areas of our experience, maybe noticing the trees on the side of the road, or just even following the path of our breath. And by involving these other domains, we find that we can actually turn that volume down a little bit, and that anger doesn't feel quite so intense. Paradoxically, it can also be very helpful just to mindfully accept that the emotion is there. Often when we try to struggle with the emotion, even with, for example, spiritual bypassing, and we think thoughts about how wrong it is to feel that feeling, whether it's anger, sadness, anxiety, we actually make that emotion even more intense. And by accepting that it's there and saying, okay, here is anger, that actually has the effect, surprisingly, of soothing it. Emotional regulation ideally should be a flexible process, allowing for us to hold our emotions gently. We don't want to turn the volume off and push them away. We also don't want to blast the volume so that it drowns out everything else by leaning into our emotions so much that that's all that fills the space. I want to also touch on something that I feel is a really important part of this, and something that we discussed in the discussion section of the last presentation, which is that our emotions are morally neutral. Any emotion, whatever it is neither good nor bad. We may not like the feeling. Many of us don't particularly enjoy being sad or angry or anxious, but that doesn't mean that the feeling is bad. We may also not like how we respond to it. For example, when we're angry, we may silently seethe or we may raise our voices, and we can dislike the reaction, but that doesn't make the emotion itself bad. The emotion is just an experience. It just contains information for us, and our choice is in how we respond to that emotion. Oh, I've jumped ahead of myself here and already read this slide, but to recap this a little bit, the important part here is not about the emotion and making a judgment about whether that's good or bad and whether we want to try to get rid of it, because we don't want to try to get rid of our emotions. We just want to be flexible in turning that volume up or down, and we want to involve that emotional experience in the context of all of our other levels of experiencing, so that we can make choices that are well-informed and that feel right to us. And here we have a little diagram that illustrates that. So we never want to emotional bypass either. We don't want to give our emotions the spotlight and push every other level of our experience to the side because they're all important. We want to engage our emotions, our cognitions, our physical experience, and all of the information that these have to offer to us, as well as our spiritual or philosophical lens that usually has our values. We put all of this together, really try to understand this experience, and then we are faced with a choice. How do we want to respond to this experience in a way that aligns with our values? And this is what we have control over, is in choosing this response. Something that I think is really common for people who come from religious backgrounds is a worry that they'll be overpowered by emotions if they listen. They've been taught that these emotions might get the best of them, that they'll be overcome by their anger and out of control if they let themselves experience it. But in fact, we need to turn up the volume sometimes to know how to turn it down. We need to listen to our emotions and try to understand them in order to know how to respond to them. Just like we discussed as we were talking about being curious about our emotions, we need to actually ask them those questions, understand what the physical signs that tell us they're there are. We need to understand what are the cognitions that are attached to them. And we need to understand what they're trying to tell us and what they need from us in order to really effectively turn that volume down and soothe them when it's appropriate. And something that I really like to emphasize here as well is that situational context is key. We need to think about when it's the right time to tune into those emotions, when it's safe for us, and when we're in the right space to do so. Sometimes it's not a good time to tune into them and close your eyes and ask them those questions, and that's okay. In those moments, we might want to turn the volume down a little bit and let them know that we'll be back to listen to them later. And I touched on some of these exercises a little bit earlier because I really wanted to include them. But here are some kind of specific exercises that you can use to turn the volume up or down. And to turn it up, we discussed some of these exercises, including the rain meditation, focusing, as well as bringing in some of those reflections that we covered at the beginning of the presentation. I also included dropping the anchor as a way to turn up the volume, but I find that sometimes it can be most effective in turning that volume down when we want to bring in that mindfulness and engage those other domains as well. Mindful acceptance and grounding are a really important part of this, accepting that the emotion is there and grounding to involve our sense of the physical world around us. And in case you're not familiar with grounding, what that means is basically just really situating ourselves in the physical world, seeing if we can name some things that we see, name some things that we hear, name some things that we feel, and that really gets us to engage with some of those other domains and outside of that emotional domain when it's taking up all that space. And finally, I want to touch on just some general factors that I find really important in healing from this element of religious trauma and from religious trauma in general, which includes support groups, reaching out and talking to people who have had similar experiences to you. Therapy can be a great place to start exploring how to tune into these emotions and reconnect with them again, particularly when you're working on that first step of building emotional awareness. Telling your story can also be an important part of this, to let people know that they're not alone, and to hear other stories, to know that you're not alone in this. And that's all from me for tonight. So thank you again, everyone, for having me and for bearing with me during the PowerPoint switch. I appreciate your patience.
Thanks very much, Caroline. Now, before we move to, first join me in thanking Caroline for a very informative presentation. So before we go to questions and discussion, I just want to remind you that the recording for this session will be posted on the rationalrealm.com website, so it's www.rationalrealm.com, along with the podcast, and also you'll be able to download Caroline's PowerPoint presentation slides as well.